From the EPR Creation Studio, this is Unconquered with Doc Staples. As always, brought to you by EPR Creations, bringing you the best of internet marketing and website development for an affordable price. By Louis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida. By Shenandoah Newsma of ShenRealEstate.com in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, and by Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida. As always, support our sponsors if you need anything in those areas, and then we'll benefit from it. You'll benefit from it because these are good people, good companies. Let them know you heard about them from Unconquered with Doc Staples. Well, we're here again at the end of actually a pretty long week for me, long week and a half since I last did anything. And so there's a few questions that have come in since the last one that I'm going to address first, and then we'll get to the Wake Forest preview, which, I mean, honestly, I think at this stage of the season, a lot of us are just kind of fatigued. And do we really want to do previews? Because there's a certain point of unpredictability with this team right now, where they've played. You look at some of the EPA stuff, and on a down for down basis, this is a much better team than its record, but it doesn't really matter if you don't win games. So we'll talk some about that later, but I'm getting a bunch of questions about coaches, about all sorts of things. And, first thing is I'm getting tons of questions about, who does Florida State hire if they do move on from Mike Norvell, which seems the most likely thing at this point. And, next question, of course, with that is, are they going to move on from Mike Norvell after the comments that Alford gave about evaluating the program and all of that at the end of the season, and all, why haven't they made a move and all of that? So first things first, I do think it is unlikely that we see Mike Norvell on the sideline at Florida State next year. Several things we can talk about down the line with that, but I do think that the general momentum, the sort of direction that this is going is that it's going to be fairly unlikely. I don't think that he's likely to get fired between now and the end of the season, unless they go out and they lose against Wake this week, which entirely, that's entirely possible. Wake has proved to be a tough out for some good teams this season. So, if they go out there and they lose to Wake Forest at home, it's going to be very difficult for Florida State not to make a move right away. That said, I do wonder what the real benefit is of making a move right away. I mean, you're costing yourself a little bit more money because, waiting until the end of the year, you wait a little bit longer in terms of money. Secondly, you don't really have natural people on staff that are going to want to take over. I mean, I'm not sure that Gus Malzahn stays. You say, oh, well, put Gus Malzahn at the interim head coach. I don't think Gus Malzahn wants to do that. And I think that's part of a consideration when you're in a position of potentially replacing somebody. I mean, do you elevate Odell Higgins to be the interim yet again for a third time? I mean, maybe, but I think there's a lot of logistics with that. The other thing that keeps coming up on the back end when I've checked on this is that when Florida State reached out to some of the whales, some of the big donors who have, the resources to potentially stroke the kind of check that they would need to stroke to make this firing happen, they were basically told, we're not going to pay for that. Sorry, we are not paying for that kind of buyout. Just not happening. And so, at that point, then the athletic department has to go to the university itself and to other sources of funding and say, hey, so, what are we going to do here? And the university has basically said, not our problem. That's your problem. Your side of the house, you take care of it. So, I think right now part of the issue is that Florida State just simply does not have the money put together to, get rid of Mike Norvell. I mean, I think there are some people within the house who would want that to have been done by now, but they just don't have the funds to do it. This is not, Texas A&M or SMU or, a place with massive oil money where they can just tap the shoulders of a couple people and it's a, tax write-off basically, like, oh yeah, whatever. It's a rounding error for some of these people. And Florida State just doesn't have those kinds of deep pockets to be able to absorb that level of guaranteed money, which makes those kinds of contracts especially stupid for a place like Florida State. You can't do that. You can't afford that kind of thing. And, I have to say a bunch of, if you're Florida State, you got to hope that a place like LSU holds the line and sort of resets the negotiation. I mean, the LSU governor has stepped in, and Scott Woodward got fired because of his role in negotiating the huge guaranteed money contract for Brian Kelly at LSU. And basically, the governor said, "There's under no circumstances are we going to let him hire another guy." I mean, this is a guy who he hired Jimbo Fisher, and then he at Texas A&M, then moved on to LSU and hired Brian Kelly. And both of those institutions are now paying for it due to him having given, essentially set the precedent and changed the market by giving those guys enormous amounts of guaranteed money. And, the best thing that could happen for Florida State and for everybody else in this coaching market is if LSU basically steps in and says, we aren't paying that kind of guaranteed money. It's just, that's not happening. And the reason it matters from LSU is clearly the best job on the market at this point. And they'll be the best job no matter who hits, unless maybe Sark goes to the NFL. Sark goes to the NFL, then Texas probably steps to the front of the line. But absent that, LSU is the best job on the market. And they're in a position where they can basically say, we're not paying the guaranteed money. So, come back when you have someone who's willing to take a reasonable contract. That's kind of what you have to hope for. And, that's not ideal for Florida State to be in the position where, they're depending on other people, other programs to do that sort of thing. But in any case, FSU's in a position where I just don't think they have the money to fire Norvell at this point. I do think eventually they may be able to get that. I mean, there's all sorts of rumors about, sources of money, whether that's the Seminole tribe and, naming rights to Doak Campbell and, all sorts of different things that, are getting floated around. And, I don't have the time to get into all those rumors. I mean, obviously there's a whole lot that's floating around, and, those are the sorts of things. This is the kind of soap opera stuff that I'm just so not interested in. And I'll be honest, when it comes to the subject matter for this kind of podcast, I started this podcast, 2012 or 2013, because, and I was working for scout.com at the time, doing the Knoll Digest site. And one of the reasons that I got into this to begin with is that I got frustrated by a lot of the outlets that were covering Florida State at the time, because I didn't think that they understood football very well. My impression in spending the time doing this stuff was that these guys couldn't really draw up scheme or, what was actually explain what was happening on the field very well. And my mission, what I got into this to do was to try to explain, like, okay, yeah, you're hearing this, this, and this, but that's not really how this works. What's really happening is that. And here's where the, the actual stuff is where the actual rubber is meeting the road. And I wanted to provide, sort of an educational aspect to the to my analysis and really focus on the on-field stuff. And I have to say, I've gotten pretty tired of the last few years where everything is just, it's all the off the field soap opera stuff. And, look, if I wanted to do soap opera stuff, there's fictional universes out there that are really fun and, lower stakes and, can do the analysis of those things. But I just, the soap opera aspect of this is, the part that I don't really understand the level of interest in a lot of those things. For me, let me see what's going on the field and we'll spend our time there. So I have to say, I'm a little fatigued by the amount of soap, the soap suds that are surrounding the Florida State program and college football as a whole. Again, I like the chess match of it all. I like the actual between the lines. Here's what you're doing in practice. Here's what you're repping. Here's why this scheme works well against that scheme, except if they've got that guy who's a dude at that position. And that's the stuff that I like. So, I'm not really I'm not going to be digging through a ton of stuff to just find source after source about, oh, they're going to get funding from here or there. But I do appreciate, I mean, there's a lot of people out there who've, been good sources for me on different things and have explained what's happening behind the scenes at different points. And so where I do get different things, I still will deliver those things where necessary and where it seems prudent. There's some stuff I'm sitting on right now that, honestly, a couple of these people have said you can't go with it yet. And the only reason right now is because I know you won't. It is what it is. So, but in any case, on the coaching side, I mean, I just think there's only so much we can know right now. And, like I said, I think the reason that Mike Norvell has not been fired at this point is simply a money issue. I mean, I think he would have been fired after last year or, late last year if it hadn't been for all the guaranteed money. That kind of guaranteed money, is the reason that coaches want contracts with this kind of guaranteed money is that it makes you a whole lot harder to fire. I mean, that's the thing. So yeah, you have job security. You can actually implement your plan, your situation, and it doesn't get you killed if, one quarterback decision or one injury, causes you to have a rash of losses, and then all of a sudden you get fired. Well, of course you want the guaranteed money to prevent that. And the margins in college football now, I think, are tighter than they've been in decades. And, so it's a place where I think a lot more fans, even of established programs, are going to have to get used to, 7-5 and 8-4 seasons or worse in many cases, where that would have been unthinkable, even 10 years ago. I just think it's a different world now. And with those very narrow margins, it's just the nature of the beast that sometimes that's going to result in coaches losing jobs. I mean, we saw it this year. I mean, Franklin was a few plays from being in the national title game last year at Penn State. They were in the second round of the college football playoff, and all of a sudden they lose 4 games in a row. And this season, after being up against top 10 Oregon in the fourth quarter, and all of a sudden 4 weeks later, the guy's fired. So, that's the nature of the beast now. And I think that's where a lot of things are going until people start to recognize the tightness of the margins, and some of those things may change a little bit. But, we're just going to kind of be in this new world for a while. And, who knows how much Lane Kiffin is going to end up getting paid. I mean, he might end up getting paid $12 or $14 million a year by some hopeful AD, whether that's at Ole Miss or whatever, because, he's the hot name and he's found a way to make himself that hot name. But, I ask you, what has he ever done that actually gives you any indication that he's worth that he's that kind of guy? I mean, he's never won anything. He's never won as a head coach. He's been in one of the top 3 jobs in the country at USC. I think that's a top 3 to 5 job in the country, and he couldn't win there. And then he was at Tennessee, and they were okay. And then he's been at Ole Miss, and they've had basically a blank check, and they've been one of the biggest spenders in terms of roster. And he hasn't even made the SEC championship game there. So, I mean, but everybody seems to want him. So, he's going to get paid a ton. And, I think somebody's eventually going to regret how much they pay. But that's the nature of the beast right now. That's where it is. A few things that I have heard that, I can pass along. I think this is legitimate. Mike Elko is the prime target for Penn State. That's tough for them because right now it's a real chance that Texas A&M is a legitimate national title contender. But, Elko is from that area of the country. There's a relationship there with the athletic director. And, from what I'm told, he's the top target at Penn State. Now, that would, again, reset a lot of things in the market if he decided to make that move, because, Texas A&M would all of a sudden be on the market again. But I'm not sure if you're Elko, if you can take that job, if all of a sudden Texas A&M is in the college football playoff with a legitimate chance to win. And, Penn State, can you wait on him in that context? You got to imagine if you're Penn State, you kind of want him to lose a couple times. And I'm not sure Texas A&M will. But their schedule gets tough. So we'll see. But yeah, I'm getting all sorts of things about like who would Florida State hire. And, my general take on this right now is that if Florida State does fire Mike Norvell, one of the things that they're looking at is they're going to look at the bottom line and which coach can they get that's a guy that's likely to win, that they can get on the cheap. Somebody who has major offset language, who's a recently fired coach, who has major offset language in his contract that they can hire for below market value effectively. And so that puts, guys like, Franklin. I know Jimbo Fisher has been actively campaigning for the job behind the scenes. I don't think Jimbo Fisher is likely to be the hire because there are some significant headwinds. There's still a lot of people who are very upset about how he left. There's people on the board of trustees who absolutely do not want him to be the head coach at Florida State. There's people in the athletic department who still very much don't like Jimbo. He's got his partisans who are absolutely supporting him and are trying to, pull out the stops to get him in that mix. And then there's people who, really, including a couple guys who played for him, who are saying no, that Florida State absolutely should not hire him. So, but he's a guy that because of the situation where he could take a much lower pay and would probably be willing to take a lot lower pay, especially initially to do it, he would be viable, in that respect, if you want to try that. But, is that the best idea? Your judgment is probably going to be decided regardless of what I say. So we'll just leave it at that for now. I think Franklin from Penn State is, of course, a guy that has a lot of interest from Florida State fans. And I do think that, again, the offset language in his contract and the fact that you could probably sign him for a reasonable deal initially makes him attractive for Florida State. I think he would be a subpar hire for Florida State. I don't think he would be a good hire, an especially good hire. I don't think, and I've already been out on the record that, I don't think he would be a good fit culturally in terms of his approach to running a program at Florida State. But again, we'll see. Brian Kelly is another guy that just recently fired. Would Florida State potentially try to hire Kelly? To me, that would be, that's one I definitely don't want to see. I mean, I'm rooting for Florida to hire Kelly. Let them hire Brian Kelly. Let's see if he can learn an Ocala accent or something and go from there. But, those are guys that would be, potentially of interest for Florida State because of the offset language, if nothing else. And, economics are going to be a factor here. So I don't know. I mean, I've gotten questions about, would you hire Manny Diaz? Manny I would rather have Manny, who, by the way, coached under Franklin for a little bit. Would you hire Manny Diaz or wait it out? What would you do there? And, I think Manny actually has certain things that I think culturally would actually fit better at Florida State than he did even in Miami. And he would be a better fit than Franklin at Florida State. I think he's a defensive guy who wants to score points. I mean, he's a guy that hired Rhett Lashley as his offensive coordinator in Miami. He's willing to kind of go with that up-tempo kind of approach. He's not going to play as close to the vest as somebody like Franklin's inclined to. And he's a pressure defense guy. He's a guy, he's a Florida State grad. He's a guy that has some Florida State background there and ultimately is a Mickey Andrews disciple when it comes down to it defensively. I think culturally, Manny would make a lot of sense, but I'm not sure that Florida State can outbid Duke for him, to be honest. And, that's a whole different question. But, I think Manny would be very interested in the job. I would take Manny over Franklin. I would take Manny over Brian Kelly for sure. I'd take Franklin over Kelly for what it's worth. But I'd take Manny over both of those guys. But, Manny would not be toward the top of my list. But, I'm not opposed entirely to that one. It's not crazy. So much of this is just, again, it's a lot of speculation at this point. And, just trying to walk through what my natural responses are to a lot of these questions that I've gotten this week. Final thing before we get to the actual preview part is I've gotten a lot of stuff about, questions about like, what makes Curt Signetti so successful? Why is it that he has been able to win without all the 5 stars and all of that at Indiana? Like what has made that work? What is it about him that he's been able to, his career record is insane. Like what separates him? And, my take is Signetti is, first of all, he's very much a super high accountability guy. He's a detail oriented detail freak. He's going to get the details right on everything. and he's going to require that everybody be right down to the minute details, to the yard. You have to be here. Everything has to be perfect. He's one of those guys. And, Florida State had that with Jimbo Fisher, 2012, 2013, to a lesser extent, 2014. They had that. And I heard all these people in and around Florida State complaining about how difficult a person Jimbo Fisher was, because he was just so demanding about everything. And, wide receivers had to be exactly in the right spot every time, or he'd climb all over you. And, it's just so difficult. Like, maybe you could be a little more of a player's coach on different things. Look, if you want to be successful as a coach, the first place that it starts is with that level of detailed accountability. You have to get the details right, and there's nothing that you can let slip. If you let one thing go, all of a sudden that infects the whole thing. So you pair that with with also him having a good eye for specific types of talent, and for quarterbacks especially. He's always had at least one very good quarterback. I mean, they've had elite quarterback play at Indiana the last couple of years. And you take that level of quarterback play, and then you take that with, he does a good job of just finding athletes. And then you put those athletes into space with the quarterback, and you get the details right on the offensive and defensive line. And all of a sudden you're going to be a good football team. That's just the way it works. And then you pair that with Indiana managing their schedule very well. Indiana's not opening with Alabama. Last season, they had one of the easiest schedules of any Power 5 team. This season, they've played really two teams with a pulse. And this is the recipe. One of the things that the ACC has done wrong, and even Florida State at different points has done wrong. I mean, Florida State, the history is play anyone, anywhere, anytime. And, that road warrior mentality that was forged under Bobby Bowden is great. But, in this day and age, if you really want major success, you better fatten up on cupcakes as much as possible, and, handle your business against those teams while being as detail oriented as possible. And Florida State's, opening schedule, first 4 weeks of I'll say the first four Power 4 games that they had were no picnic. It's just the reality. They had two absolute cupcake games in there after Alabama. But then after that, they've played several teams with a pulse, and teams that had especially had a pulse at the time that they played them. Virginia is a quality team. They've been one of the luckiest teams in the country. They've fumbled 9 or 10 times and have recovered all of them. It's crazy. They're 3-0 in overtime. They had a safety to prevent that, in the last minute or two of a game to prevent them from going to overtime in another one. That's a team that's played absolutely on the margins and has gotten lucky as all get out. But still a team with a pulse. Miami of Florida, team with a pulse. They played some, and then they go out and lose to Stanford. That's a team that, has a faint pulse, if any. I don't think they really have a pulse, but those first four, Alabama, Virginia, Miami, Florida, and Pitt, those are all teams that played good football this season. And, Indiana hasn't played a bunch of those. And when they have, they've curb stomped them, except for that Oregon game where they came out and they won, but they didn't curb stomp that very good Oregon team. But they've curb stomped the rest of them because they've come out with just that level of detail. They don't turn the football over, and they've got elite quarterback play. That makes things a lot easier, guys. That's the secret sauce. If you have elite quarterback play, look at Miami and Florida last year. Cam Ward made them a whole different beast. And they've had good quarterback play this year from Beck. And in a game where he was able to get pressured and they were able to expose a little bit of that, that's the game they lost. That's just reality right now. So, yeah, I think we've gone plenty long enough on this. I think it's time to go ahead and move into the preview portion of the show. Okay, so now Florida State goes from losing on the road at Stanford in a game where, look, and I said this after that game, I could understand losing any one of those first 4 games that you played against Power 5 competition. Virginia, Miami, Florida, Pittsburgh, those are all understandable losses. That Stanford loss, that was a really bad loss to a bad football team. And now you're going to play a team that's better than that Stanford team. This Wake Forest team is not especially talented, but they're a very well-coached football team. You know, and I actually think Jake Dickert is a guy that should probably be on Florida State's radar if they replace Mike Norvell. You look at what he did, and he won at Washington State. My goodness. The guy won at Washington State, and now this year he's got a Wake Forest team that really doesn't have a whole lot of talent, one win away from bowl eligibility. And they've gotten better over the course of the season. There's no doubt about that. I mean, they opened the season with a 10-9 win over Kennesaw State. They very nearly lost to Kennesaw State. And then the next week, they got better. They beat Western Carolina 42-10, lost to NC State 34-24. Then they hosted Georgia Tech and very nearly beat Georgia Tech, and that's a good Georgia Tech team. They lost to Georgia Tech by 30-29, and Georgia Tech had to come back and beat them on that. Then they took it to Virginia Tech 30-23. They beat Oregon State at Oregon State 39-14, and then they gave SMU their first ACC loss, which is wild to think about. This was the first time that SMU has lost an ACC game. They beat SMU at Wake Forest, last second 50-yard field goal as time expired, 13-12. And you know, and by the way, they beat SMU in a turnover fest. They turned it over. Wake Forest turned it over 5 times, and SMU turned it over 3 times. Now, the key turnover was one down inside the 15-yard line where SMU fumbled and Wake Forest was able to score right away on a little tight end leak throwback play where they were able to capitalize and score a touchdown. And SMU didn't score a touchdown in this game, but Wake was able to score a touchdown, convert that short field into a key score, and that really set them up to win. But yeah, I mean, last 3 games at Virginia Tech, at Oregon State, and SMU, they've won all 3 games and have done it with some, you know, quality situational play as much as anything else. You know, they've kind of gone as their turnover ratio has gone, minus they were -2 against SMU, but the more pivotal turnovers, and particularly, again, the one that led to an immediate touchdown, were committed by SMU. But you know, this is a team that has been a tough out. They've not really beaten themselves this year. They've been a difficult team to knock out, and you're talking about a Florida State team that has had difficulty knocking anybody out this season. Now, all that said, Florida State has, on a down-to-down and drive-to-drive basis, Florida State's been better than this Wake Forest team this year. They should win this game. You know, you look at the FEI rankings, and I think Florida State's like 34th or 31st right now in that. And Wake Forest is down around 55 or whatever. I just looked at it a little bit ago. I don't remember the exact figures, but it's in that range. You know, Florida State should be favored, and they are. And it's a home game. But this is a tough out. And Florida State, depending on how invested, I mean, has this team quit? Or will they come out hard in the first quarter, and then if they get hit in the mouth and, you know, Wake Forest goes up, or they have any sort of difficulties in this game, or, you know, a coach's favorite word, any sort of adversity, does this Florida State team fold? And if so, this Wake Forest team will beat them. No doubt about that. Because again, they've been the boxer who doesn't have, you know, great tools, doesn't have explosive power, isn't going to, you know, knock you out, but they just hang around and they don't get knocked out. And then eventually they may be there again, like SMU faced this last week. They may be there at the end to kick that field goal to beat you. So this is a team that you have to get in there, and you have to get into the ring, and you've got to get leverage on them. You got to get up, and you've got to find ways to pressure them into allowing you to take some swings that have a chance to put them on the canvas. But nobody has knocked this team out this year. They lost by 10 to NC State, and they were up in the second half in that game. They lost by 1 to Georgia Tech, and then they've won everything else. Nobody has knocked this team out. And again, that's a testament to Dickert and that coaching staff, the way that they've coached this team. They tackle very well. They've turned it over here and there. They've lost a total of 11 turnovers on the season. 3 against Western Carolina, 2 against NC State, which cost them that game. 5 against SMU, which somehow they won that game anyway. And then 1 against Virginia Tech. So, if you bracket that SMU game, they've done a good job for the most part on the season of taking care of the football and, reasonable job of forcing some turnovers as well. But, to me, this game really comes down on the Florida State side. This game comes down to, can FSU lean into what their identity was supposed to be at the beginning of the season and run the football and stop the run? Wake Forest has been average in terms of stopping the run on the season against teams that can run it. They were pretty good against SMU this last week. They only gave up 2.68 yards per rush against SMU, but SMU has not been actually a great run team this year. SMU is only averaging 3.97 yards per rush on the season. Now, 2.68 against Wake is a little bit better than what SMU had been getting on the season, but by and large, SMU has, and which, by the way, they're running a very similar system to Malzahn. I mean, remember, Lashley is running a fork of Malzahn's offense. He was Malzahn's offensive coordinator at Auburn. But they've struggled to run the football on the season, and Wake Forest, held them to that, largely by forcing. Wake Forest runs well sideline to sideline, and they tackle very well in space, and SMU wasn't able to take advantage of them for that reason. But at the end of the day, Florida State has to be able to run, and I think with this Wake Forest team, you run straight at them. You got to be able to run the football, and this is a game where you impose your will. You have to get after them and run straight downhill at this defense. They're not especially big. They are, 285 pounds at one defensive tackle, one starting defensive tackle, and the other starting defensive tackle isn't a whole heck of a lot bigger, 291. They're small inside. This is a team where you go after them and you run it down their throats. That's what you have to do. They're 250 at one edge, 250 at the other, and then 285 and 290 at the defensive tackles. Just put them on skates, and this is a game where if I'm Norvell, if I'm game planning for this Wake Forest team, I'm content getting into a slugfest with this team. I want to make this a game that is about the line of scrimmage, where it's just a win in a phone booth, force those guys to line up against my offensive line and my big backs and tackle them. And I'm fine with 3 to 4 yards per play. Run it downhill. And if you're not able to get a first down, fine, kick it. Force them to score on your defense without the quarterback play that you faced so far this year. Robbie Ashford has been their starter over the course of the season. Deshaun Purdy, who is a transfer, he was behind Lagway at Florida before transferring to Wake Forest in the offseason. He actually started the last game, and he's got more tools as a quarterback. He's a more live arm than Ashford. He's 6'4", 228. He's a big kid too, big guy. But Ashford has been the guy. Ashford's listed as questionable. And Ashford's a guy that's now on his 4th school. He was at South Carolina, then Auburn, and then Oregon, and now at Wake Forest. But, he's not been real good this year. He's been, 3 touchdowns, 4 picks. Really hasn't impressed me as a thrower. Now, he can run it a little bit, but he's not dynamic there. Purdy brings in a live arm, but he's a little bit scattershot in terms of accuracy. He can really spin it. I mean, he can throw it through a wall, but he's not always going to throw it to his target. To me, again, force them to beat you throwing the football with those guys who are not especially accurate and who've been prone to throwing some interceptions. I mean, Purdy's 5 touchdowns, 2 picks on the year. It's better, but against Power 5 stuff, he's actually not been great. 5 of those, the 5 touchdowns have not all come against Power 4 opponents. So to me, make this a line of scrimmage game. Load the box on defense. Load the box, or let them load the box on offense and still run it. Don't let them game you. And this is one of the dangers of Malzahn's approach, is sometimes he can get gamed out of running between the tackles. I think this happened against Miami, for example, Miami of Florida. I think they did a good job of scheming it to where they presented some throw options when it was RPO, and you take the throw option when really you should just go ahead and bash your head against the line, against the wall, because you're actually going to get more consistently out of running it on even the loaded boxes at times. And I think this is a game where you run it even against certain loaded box looks. And in other cases, yeah, you take the outlet or whatever, but you have to be judicious about when you do it, because they do a good job of rallying to the perimeter and tackling in space. And so, there's too many times where you watch them against these teams that they've played where they're able to rally to the football, make tackles in space. They're able to get some pressure on the quarterback when you're trying to throw it at different points, and then you're not able to throw it as well as you'd like. And they've got, I think, borderline elite, not quite elite, but a very good pass defense. I don't think you want to line up and throw it 30 times against this team. I think if Florida State throws the ball 30 times in this game, they probably lose the game. This is a game where go in with the thought that you're going to try to run the football 50 times. And by the way, there's a real chance that Florida State's not starting Tommy Castellanos. There's a real chance that, he's listed as probable on the report. That doesn't mean that he's actually going to play. That just has to do with his availability. I think there's a real chance that you see Kevin Sperry as the starter in this game, and as the guy that takes most of the snaps, even if he isn't the starter. Well, he is, a more promising downfield thrower than Castellanos. He's a more promising thrower in general. But do you want to bank on throwing the football with a true freshman against a really good pass defense, or do you want to take advantage of a team that's not real big inside and has given up some plays to opposing rush offenses? Virginia Tech, 35 carries, 152 yards, 4.34 yards per carry. NC State, 44 carries, 205 yards, 4.66 yards per carry. Those are probably the closest to Florida State in terms of rush offenses that Wake Forest has played. Maybe Georgia Tech as well. Georgia Tech, 42 carries, 163 yards, 3.88 yards per play, per carry. So those three. So I think you can average 4 yards per carry ish against this team. And I think with Florida State's offensive line and scheme and backs, they could go for 5 plus. You just have to focus on it, and you have to actually push for that in this game. Now, one thing Wake Forest doesn't do is give up a ton of long run plays. Now, they're pretty good on that front. They're not great at stopping long runs, but they've only given up 4 runs of over 20 yards. That's about 54th or so in the country against Power 4 competition. They've only given that up. Now, when it comes to stopping just general chunk run plays over 10 yards, they're 94th. 23 runs of 10 yards or more that they've given up on the season to Power 4 competition. That's 94th. To me, that right there is your answer. If you're Norvell, if you're Gus Malzahn, if you're Florida State, you come into this saying, we're going to live on those little chunk runs. And if, maybe our guy does break a tackle and take it further, but even if he doesn't, it's totally fine to, 8-yard, 10-yard, 12-yard runs and just keep the chains turning and stay ahead of the chains in this one. If Florida State doesn't turn it over in this game, they're really in position to be able to kind of lean into the identity that they were supposed to be, run the football, stop the run, get out with a win. Now, running the football themselves, if we flip over to the offensive side for Wake Forest, so the Florida State defensive side, Wake Forest hasn't really been able to run the football a bunch on anybody with a pulse either. If you bracket the 8 yards per carry, almost 9 yards per carry against Western Carolina, 2.68 yards per carry against NC State, 2.84 against Virginia Tech, 2.43 against SMU. Those are your closest comparisons to Florida State's talent level on defense. Now against Georgia Tech, for some reason, they found something against Georgia Tech and went 40 carries for 210 yards, averaged 5.25 and 3 scores. And then at Oregon State, 7.6 yards per carry. 7.6 yards per carry against Oregon State. So they've shown that they can do it in certain cases. That's a very talent-free Oregon State team. Georgia Tech, that's concerning that they gave up 5.25. But Georgia Tech has given up some yardage on the ground to a few teams this season. You look at what Georgia Tech's been able to do on the ground. They gave up 5 yards per carry against Clemson, 4 yards per carry against Temple, 5.25 against Wake Forest, 5.47 yards per carry against Virginia Tech, and 4.62 yards per carry against Syracuse. So they've been giving up some yardage on the ground. That's been Georgia Tech's Achilles heel all season. That's what Wake Forest was able to do to them. But against teams that have been able to stop the run at all, and that's been one of the things that Florida State has actually done pretty well this season for the most part. It's not been great, but it's been better than say what you see from Georgia Tech. They've struggled to run the football against decent defenses, against defenses with decent fronts. So then they have to lean on the passing game, and that's when they've turned it over. That's where their quarterbacks not being especially accurate has come into play. Against Oregon State, they had success, no turnovers in the passing game. Against Georgia Tech, they had success, no turnovers in the passing game. And again, because they were able to run it. But against NC State, against Virginia Tech, against SMU, they turned the ball over because they were not able to run the football. To me, that's this ball game. Wake Forest is not going to be able to line up and just throw the ball on you all game with the quarterbacks that they have, with the skill guys that they have, if they're not able to run the football. That's just not what they're built to do. But if they're able to run the football, you're going to have trouble. It's going to be painful. So stop the run the football, and don't turn it over. Florida State wins potentially comfortably. Do we really think that's going to happen? I don't know. So that brings us then to, at this point, to this week's experiment in throwing darts. What do I think is likely to happen? Really, I don't know coming out of the bye how much this team has rebought in, how invested they are, how hard they're going to fight for this coaching staff. I just don't know. If Florida State goes out and they're angry and they're going to fight to win games and to dominate and do all of that, and they play hard up front the way that they did in the fourth quarter against Stanford, but they didn't in the middle part of that game, the way that they did in the fourth quarter at different points against Miami, but they lapsed some in the middle of that game as well. If they play hard like they did against Alabama, if that's what you're going to get, then I think you're able to win the line of scrimmage. Florida State wins this game potentially by double figures. I'm not willing to bet on that at this stage, though. I think this is going to be a much closer game, and I'm not sure that at this point you can really count on this Florida State team to win anything. I'm still gonna go by honestly, I'm going by ratings at this point, in addition to just the matchups that I'm seeing in the run game. But as much as anything, I'm just going by, it's a home game. The overall level of play of both teams, if you look at that, you kind of expect FSU to win this one. So that's what I'm going to pick, but I don't feel real good about it. I think this one, if FSU is even -1 in the turnover column, they may lose this game. But I'm going to go with this being reasonably close, uncomfortable, the way that it should not be. And it'll be probably a game, in the 20s to, low 30s. I'm going to go with FSU wins this game 27-24. Uncomfortable, but, enough that you probably don't see Mike Norvell getting fired this next week after this Wake Forest game. But we'll see. That's what I'm going to go with. I'm not comfortable with it. I don't feel like I have a real handle on this game. I don't feel like I have a handle on this team at this stage of the season. But that's where I'm at. That's the best I'm going to do. So we'll call it there. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Doc Staples. Thanks for listening. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please leave a 5-star rating over at Apple Podcasts and wherever else you listen to podcasts. Post and repost episodes on social media and tell a friend. And if you haven't left a review in a while, do it again. It really does help the visibility of the podcast. Before we go, I'd also like to thank my advertising partners once more. That's EPR Creations, Luis Marquez of Momentum Realty in Jacksonville, Florida, Shenandoah Real Estate in the Research Triangle of North Carolina, Garage Makeovers, the #1 garage remodeling company in South Florida, and Justin Galloway of Benchmark Mortgage, serving Florida, Tennessee, and Kentucky. You can also stop by the Unconquered Shop at unconqueredpodcast.com, where you can buy stickers, pins, magnets, t-shirts, and other swag. I am especially grateful for those of you at the Dynasty level. That is Brian Leininger, Dave Blair, Jack Horton, Jonathan Kennedy, Lee Caswell, Travis Smith, and Tyler Kashishki. You all are far more generous than I deserve. Thanks to you all. This has been Unconquered with Doc Staples. I'm your host, Jason Staples. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. I made this.